Welcome to Charlie's Bedtime Stories. The first thing Charlie noticed was not the noise, but the smell of a fire someone had lit 2 streets away. Wood smoke and warm bread, with the sweet edge of figs roasting near an oven. It belonged to a Roman morning full of rules he had not yet been told. This was Rome on a cool February day when the city woke early for one of its oldest and strangest festivals. Good evening and welcome. Settle in wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop and allow the room to grow still around you. Tonight we are going somewhere very old and very warm, and you are welcome to drift off whenever sleep finds you. Our traveler is a young man named Charlie. He does not know exactly how he arrived here, and for now he does not much mind. He has opened his eyes in a narrow side street in ancient Rome on the 15th of February in the year we would call 44 before Christ. The sky above the rooftops is turning from charcoal to pale rose, and the city is only beginning to stir. Tonight is a quiet walk through Rome on the morning of the Lupercalia, one of the city's oldest festivals. We will notice not only the public ritual, but the ordinary life around it. The bakers opening their ovens, the women carrying water, the keys at a matron's waist, the laundry, the little household shrines, the thresholds being swept, and the curious social rules that made this day feel perfectly normal to people who had grown up inside it. Charlie will find himself mistaken for one of the young men attached to the ritual group called the Luperci, and he will be drawn gently into the movement of the morning. He will see how a city famous for marble still remembered shepherds, wolves, goatskins, and luck. He will pass sleepy shops and busy households, and later, in the Forum, he will glimpse a famous public gesture involving Julius Caesar and a simple white band of cloth. But tonight, that moment is only one detail in a larger picture, a Roman festival day as it might have felt from the street. Along the way, we'll keep close to the small things, the scent of warm bread, the careful guarding of olive oil and grain, the sound of a loom upstairs, the splash of a fountain, the way a whole household could be arranged around a doorway, a pantry, and a set of keys. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into the past, take a moment to subscribe so you can wander through another vanished morning with us again. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling me which lost century you would most like to visit. I do read them, and I love seeing where your curiosity wants to go. For now, lower the lights. Let the day you've had begin to fade. There is no need to remember any of this. Just walk beside Charlie as the sky brightens over the rooftops of a city, preparing quite calmly to do something very old and very strange. Charlie was lying on a folded cloak, tucked against a wall of warm brick. He did not remember choosing the spot, or the cloak, or the wall. Yet he felt oddly rested, the way you feel after a long journey when someone else has done all the steering. Above him, the rooftops were terracotta, curved and overlapping like the scales of a sleeping animal. The sky behind them had softened from black to gray, and now to the faint pink of the inside of a shell. Somewhere, a rooster complained. Somewhere else, a shutter creaked open on a stiff hinge. He heard footsteps first, slow, even footsteps, and the slosh of water in a heavy jar. A woman was carrying it up from a public fountain, balancing it against her hip, walking the way people walk when they have done this every morning of their lives. Her tunic was belted high enough not to catch her feet, and a loose shawl had been drawn over her hair against the morning chill. She did not glance at Charlie for long. In Rome, a young man asleep in an alley during a festival morning might be curious, but not curious enough to delay the water. Water had to be carried, fires had to be coaxed awake, dough had to be checked, children had to be fed before they could make themselves inconvenient. Charlie sat up and understood, with a strange and quiet certainty, that he was truly here, not dreaming. Here. The smell was what pulled him to his feet, warm bread, and beneath it, the darker sweetness of figs roasting near a fire. In Rome, you could often guess a family's fortune by what their mornings smelled like. Wealthier homes might begin the day with better bread, eggs, honey, fruit, or leftovers from the night before. Working families made do with something plainer. Perhaps yesterday's bread softened with a little wine or water, a handful of olives, a bit of cheese if the household was fortunate. But the scent of the bakery belonged to everyone, because many Roman homes did not have the sort of kitchen that could bake bread properly. Ovens were communal in spirit, even when privately run. The smell drifted down the alleys like an invitation. Charlie followed it to a low doorway where a sleepy baker was sliding pale loaves onto a stone shelf with a long wooden paddle. Flour dusted the man's forearms. A bowl of figs sat cooling near the oven's mouth, and sprigs of rosemary and thyme hung from a beam, filling the little room with a green, peppery sharpness. Beside the doorway, a woman counted small coins into her palm. Before choosing a loaf, she pressed it lightly with her fingers, judging the crust, while a child beside her stared solemnly at the figs, as though willing one of them to become his by moral force alone. The baker nodded at Charlie, the way tired working people nod at each other before the day has truly begun. Charlie nodded back, and for a moment he simply stood in the warmth, breathing. Out in the street, Rome was waking in earnest. Doors opened, a dog stretched, two men argued cheerfully about the price of onions. The 15th of February was not an ordinary morning, but ordinary work did not stop simply because the city had a festival to perform. A slave girl shook dust from a mat over the street, then thought better of it when the dust blew back into her own face. A woman swept her threshold in short, efficient strokes, pushing yesterday's grit toward the gutter. An old man set out a stool by his doorway and began repairing a sandal with the concentration of a philosopher. Charlie passed a small household shrine just inside an entrance where a lamp flame trembled in the dawn air. Someone had placed a little offering there, perhaps a pinch of grain, perhaps a scrap from the morning meal. The gods of the grand temples had marble steps and public processions. The household gods had corners, shelves, lamps, and the daily attention of whoever remembered. That, Charlie thought, was how much of Rome worked. Public greatness above, private repetition below. A city could conquer provinces, argue over power, build roads to the horizon, and still, every morning, someone had to decide whether there was enough oil in the jar. There were political murmurs in the air, as there often were in Rome. The name Caesar passed from mouth to mouth now and then, followed by careful pauses, shrugs, or sideways jokes about crowns and kings. Rome had long memories about kings, but down here, before the sun had fully lifted, the stronger subjects were bread, water, laundry, and whether the festival crowd would block the street before everyone's errands were finished. Charlie did not have long to think about any of it, because a group of young men came around the corner at speed, laughing, and nearly swept him up as though they had been looking for him all along. It is a peculiar feeling to be welcomed warmly by people who have entirely the wrong idea about you. They clapped him on the shoulders and called him late. They tugged at his sleeve and pulled him along, half explaining, half teasing, certain that he belonged with the young men preparing for the Lupercalia rites. Charlie tried to explain that there had been a mistake. His confused protests only made them laugh harder, because on the morning of a festival, confusion is often treated as proof that everything is going well. So he stopped protesting quite so much and let himself be carried along. He began to understand that he was not being made important exactly. He was being folded into a custom older than personal convenience. Rome, like many old cities, had a way of assuming that if a ritual needed another body and you happened to be standing nearby, then perhaps you were the answer. They hurried down toward the base of the Palatine Hill, where the crowd was already gathering around the dark mouth of a cave. The cave was cool and damp, and it smelled of stone, incense, and old smoke. Torches burned along its walls, throwing amber light across faint carvings Charlie could not quite read. This was the Lupercalia, the heart of the whole festival. Here, the Romans said, a she-wolf had once found 2 abandoned baby boys and nursed them. Those boys were Romulus and Remus, and one of them would go on to found the city itself. The Romans had newer gods and grander temples all over the hill above. But on this one morning, they came back down to a damp little cave and a very old story. An older ritual leader spoke the tale in a low, chanting voice, half song and half memory. Charlie did not catch every word, but he caught the feeling of it, the sense of history folding back on itself in the torchlight. The people around him were not treating the story like a decoration. It was woven into their sense of where they were standing. A cave was not simply a cave if generations had pointed to it and said, "Here, this is where we began." Standing in that cave, Charlie began to understand something about Rome. Underneath all the marble, Rome was still, in memory, a farm town that had done extraordinarily well for itself. Long before the temples and the columns, these hills had held huts, grazing animals, kitchen gardens and paths worn by feet rather than paved for triumphal processions. Wolves belonged not only to legend, but to the worries of people who kept flocks. The health of animals mattered. The fertility of fields mattered. The boundary between settled life and wild land mattered. The Lupercalia carried traces of that older, rustic world. It was not tidy in the way later people might expect a civic ceremony to be tidy. It was earthy, local, physical, and very old-fashioned, even to some Romans themselves. That may have been part of its power. Rome loved polished marble, but it also loved being able to say, "We were here before all that." So the grand city was really a young thing wearing very old clothes. It ruled a widening world, yet once a year it came down to the hill's old foot and remembered when it was small. Charlie found that oddly touching. He also had a quiet suspicion that the old clothes in question might be rather minimal. His suspicion was correct. Near the altar, the necessary offerings were made according to custom. Charlie kept his eyes mostly on the torchlight and the faces around him. The moment was solemn rather than noisy, handled with practiced care, prayers, and a seriousness that made even the laughing young men grow still. The details passed quickly, as ritual details often do when everyone present already knows what they mean. What mattered to the Romans gathered there was not spectacle, but renewal. The old exchange between people, gods, animals, fields, families, and the hopeful turning of the year. Then, gently but firmly, Charlie's ordinary outer clothing was taken from him. In its place, he was given a narrow strip of goatskin and very little else. Charlie had worn many uncomfortable outfits in his life, but never one quite this breezy or this sacred. He stood there, bare-skinned and deeply embarrassed, his arms not entirely sure where to go. And yet, looking at the seriousness on the faces around him, he found he could not quite laugh it off. To them, This was not a costume. It was an honor, a duty, and possibly a test of how gracefully one could surrender personal dignity in public. Rome, he was beginning to learn, had many rules. Not all of them came with proper clothing. There was one more part before the running began. The young men were marked as part of the rite, and then the mark was wiped away with wool dipped in milk. And then, as tradition demanded, they were all supposed to laugh. Charlie had not expected laughter to be compulsory, which only proved how much he still had to learn. Every society has rules no one explains to visitors. In Rome on this morning, one of those rules was that after solemnity came laughter, as though the whole ritual needed a little burst of human warmth to send it out into the streets. The others managed it easily, a great ringing sound that echoed off the cave walls. Charlie's began as something uncertain, halfway between a cough and an apology. Then it slowly warmed into the real thing. Laughter, even slightly bewildered laughter, is contagious in a small stone room. Then the runners took up their strips of leather. These were the februa, the ritual straps connected by some ancient explanations to cleansing, purification, and even to the name of the month of February. As with many old customs, the meanings had gathered in layers over time. Not every Roman would have explained it in exactly the same way, but everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. The city was waiting. The runners burst from the mouth of the cave into the brightening street, and Charlie was swept out with them, bare and breathless and blinking in the sun. There is no dignified way to jog through a city in a goatskin, so Charlie simply gave up on dignity altogether. It was, he found, a great relief. Once you have accepted that you are running nearly naked past a fruit stall while strangers cheer, there is very little left to worry about. The crowd loved it in the easy, practiced way of people who had seen the same festival many times and still enjoyed watching newcomers suffer its surprises. People leaned from doorways and called out. Children ran alongside for a few paces and then peeled away, giggling. A shopkeeper paused in arranging bunches of greens, looked Charlie up and down, and gave a nod that seemed to say, "Yes, that is more or less how the morning usually goes." The runners began their loop around the old edge of the Palatine, following a path so old that most of them could not have told you exactly why it went where it went. They only knew that it did, and that it always had. And slowly Charlie's embarrassment began to turn into something else, something lighter, almost joy. As they ran, Charlie caught glimpses of ordinary Rome getting on with its day. While half-dressed ritual runners passed their doors, several Roman housewives simply kept sweeping, having seen it all before. A woman flicked her broom across a worn threshold without breaking rhythm. Another bent over a basin, rubbing cloth with steady, practical strength. A child staggered by under the weight of a water jar nearly as big as himself, watched by an older sister who clearly considered him slow but salvageable. From an upstairs window came the steady clack of a loom. The sound was dry and rhythmic, like wooden teeth clicking softly together. Woolwork was more than a chore in Roman households. It was tied to ideas of feminine virtue, family order, and respectability. Even wealthy women who did not need to spin or weave for survival might still be praised for the symbolism of it, because Rome liked its public ideals to look old, domestic, and disciplined. The smell of something simmering with beans and herbs drifted from a doorway. Somewhere, garlic was being crushed. Somewhere, a woman called sharply for a missing child, then called again in a tone suggesting the child had better not be hiding somewhere interesting. This was the Rome that no grand monument bothered to record. Not senators and speeches, but pots and thresholds and the small, endless work of keeping a household fed. Charlie loved the contrast, the sacred run going straight past the laundry, and neither, one embarrassed by the other, behind those swept thresholds stood a figure Charlie only glimpsed, but whose quiet power shaped everything. The Senate argued about who ruled Rome, but everyone knew who ruled the pantry. In many homes there was a matron, the mistress of the household, and she held the rhythm of the place. She kept the keys. She managed, or supervised, the stores of grain, oil, wine, wool, and dried fruit. She oversaw enslaved workers where the household had them, watched the accounts, guarded the family's small daily rituals, and knew exactly how long a jar of good olive oil ought to last. Charlie saw one such woman standing in a courtyard doorway as they passed, upright and unhurried, a set of keys at her waist. The keys were not delicate little ornaments. They had weight. They announced access. Behind her were shelves, jars, folded cloth, perhaps a chest where better garments were kept away from moths, damp, and careless hands. She watched the runners go by with the calm expression of someone who had watched them go by for 30 years, and who would still be standing there, keys and all, long after the shouting faded. Her authority was not soft exactly. It was quiet, practical, and difficult to argue with. In a world where men made speeches about power, she knew where the flour was, who had taken too many olives, which servant was sulking, which daughter needed new sandals, and whether the household could afford extra fish for dinner. Charlie felt, in passing, that this was one of the great hidden engines of Rome. Not conquest, not marble, but a woman at a threshold with keys at her belt. The route carried them past a row of small shops already open to the street. Roman shops did not hide behind glass windows or neat displays. They spilled outward. A counter faced the road. Goods hung from hooks or lay in baskets. The shopkeeper could see you, and, just as importantly, you could see who else was buying what. A woman examined the length of cloth, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger. She was not merely buying fabric. She was weighing status, durability, household need, and what the neighbors might think. A brighter color could suggest prosperity, but too much show might invite comment. Too plain, and people might wonder whether the family was slipping. At a food stall, a man ladled something warm into a bowl for a customer who ate standing up. The smell was savory and comforting, a mix of lentils, onions, oil, and herbs. Not everyone in Rome cooked at home every day, especially those living in crowded rooms above shops, where smoke, space, and fire were constant concerns. A hot meal from a stall could be practical, social, and if the cook was good, deeply welcome. Charlie noticed how much of the city happened in doorways. People paused there to talk, bargain, judge, flirt, complain, and observe. Rome did not need modern windows to create neighborhood surveillance. It had thresholds, stools, fountains, and aunties. As the runners passed, faces turned toward them, some amused, some devout, some mildly bored. Every glance carried a little social knowledge. Who stepped forward? Who stayed back? Who laughed too loudly? Who pretended not to care? A festival was never only a festival. It was also a morning when everyone saw everyone else. By now, Charlie had stopped thinking of himself as a runner at all, and simply let the city wash over him. If you closed your eyes in a Roman street, you could hear the whole city breathing. There was the trickle and splash of a public fountain, and the cold spray that touched his arms as he passed. There was the patient tap of a stone carver's chisel. chip by chip. There was the low murmur of gossip and haggling, the bark of a distant dog, the scrape of a shutter, and the coo of pigeons on a ledge. The street underfoot was uneven. The stones held old ruts and shallow dips where water collected. Awnings stretched across shop fronts, making stripes of shade. Laundry hung from upper windows, stirring faintly in the morning air. A basket was lowered from a balcony on a rope, received a parcel from below, and rose again with the solemn importance of a tiny elevator. A cat watched from the top of a wall, entirely unimpressed. A dog dozed in a warm doorway and did not so much as open an eye. And over all of it lay the ordinary golden light of a February morning, dappled through awnings and washing lines, warming the stone. The path carried the runners around the base of the Palatine Hill, and here the houses changed. Charlie was, quite literally, running a circle of good luck around some of the most prestigious ground in Rome. Above him rose grand houses belonging to families whose names mattered, painted walls in deep reds and warm ochres, cypress trees standing tall and dark against the sky, the soft sound of private fountains behind garden walls. Down below, people carried water in jars. Up above, water played for pleasure. The difference was not lost on Charlie. Rome was very good at placing splendor and inconvenience close together. A narrow street might smell of bread, animals, damp stone, and perfume all at once. A humble doorway might sit in the shadow of a house whose owner could change the mood of the forum with a few words. And he began to understand what the run was really doing, or at least one way to feel it. This old circuit around the hill was like drawing an invisible line, a boundary of luck and renewal around the sacred heart of the city. The runners were not merely showing off, though they were certainly doing a little of that. They were tracing the edge of something loved, the way people have always walked around fields, houses, walls, and neighborhoods, hoping the circle itself might help keep life whole. Along the route, women stepped out toward the runners, and Charlie finally understood what the leather straps were for. He had braced himself for something wild, and instead found something oddly tender. The women came forward willingly, holding out their hands or forearms so that a runner might touch them lightly with the februa. It was believed to bring luck, fertility, or an easier time in childbirth. The gesture was quick, public, and familiar. A light touch, a hopeful face, a quiet word. Some women smiled, some looked shy. Some approached with the brisk determination of people completing a practical errand, as though luck were one more household supply to be collected before noon. Older women nudged younger ones forward. Friends laughed behind their hands. A mother lifted a daughter's wrist toward the passing strap, half reverent and half matter of fact. Charlie performed his part as carefully as he could, moved by the trust in their eyes. A young woman smiled at him with real gratitude, as though he had given her something precious. And perhaps, in the language of that morning, he had. Whatever he had expected from this strange festival, it was not this mixture of embarrassment, hope, social pressure, and gentleness. It was very human. It was also very Roman, public, practical, symbolic, and impossible to explain without sounding slightly odd. The route began to slope down and open out, and ahead of him, Charlie saw the Roman Forum spread wide in the high sun. The closer they came to the Forum, the more the festival blended with the city's larger public life. Marble temples gleamed white and honey-colored. Statues caught the sun. Men in bright-bordered togas moved with the careful pace of people who knew they were being watched. The crowd grew thicker, less like a neighborhood gathering and more like Rome looking at itself. Charlie heard Caesar's name again. He heard Antony's too. The words passed through the air lightly, then disappeared among other words. Market prices, family gossip, complaints about heat, someone asking who had seen a missing cousin. The Forum was where Rome performed its importance, but even here, the ordinary pressed in at the edges. A man sold snacks from a basket. A boy tried to get a better view by standing on a block of stone until an older man pulled him down by the back of his tunic. Two women compared the quality of someone's veil in murmurs so precise they might have been conducting a legal case. Charlie slowed near the edge of the crowd, still holding the leather strap, still feeling the morning sun on his shoulders. At the heart of the Forum, on a raised platform, sat Julius Caesar. Marcus Antonius, who was connected with the day's running rights, stepped toward him, holding something out. It was a simple band of white cloth, a diadem, plain to look at, but not plain in meaning. To Roman eyes, it could suggest kingship, and kingship was a word with old discomfort folded inside it. The crowd grew quiet in that particular way crowds do when no one wants to misunderstand the moment first. Antony offered the band. Caesar refused it. Antony offered it again. Caesar refused again. There was applause then, and relief, though not the same relief in every face. Some people seemed pleased. Some seemed thoughtful. Some watched the reaction of their neighbors before choosing their own. Charlie stood at the edge, aware that later generations would remember this scene in sharper lines than it probably had while it was happening. In the moment, it was cloth, gesture, noise, sunlight, uncertainty, and thousands of people trying to read one another. And then, just as quickly, the festival day moved on. Rome had a great talent for absorbing moments into its stone, and then returning to errands. For one strange instant, Charlie felt the pull of the public scene, the sense that history was happening nearby, close enough to touch. And then, gently, he understood that this was not his moment to shape. He was not there to change Rome. He was there to notice it. Sometimes the wisest thing a person can do in history is to take one respectful step backward. So he did. He eased himself out of the crush of the crowd, away from the platform, the white cloth, and the famous men whose names would travel far beyond their own lifetimes. He slipped into the shade of a colonnade at the Forum's edge and leaned against a cool marble column. His breath slowed. The stone felt steady against his back. The afternoon light had begun to soften, turning from clear gold toward something warmer and lower. Around him, people were already beginning to talk of other things. A cloak that needed mending, a cousin's betrothal, the cost of good oil, whether the baths would be crowded, whether someone had taken the best figs from the morning market. The great day was letting go of him, one quiet degree at a time. The crowds in the Forum began to loosen and thin. The attention that had drawn everyone inward slowly unwound, and people turned back toward their ordinary afternoons, toward the market, the bath, the water jars, the kitchen fires, and the evening meal. Charlie wandered back the way he had come, in no hurry now. Somewhere along the quieting streets, one of the young men from the morning found him and pressed his ordinary clothes back into his arms with a grin and a word Charlie did not catch. He dressed gratefully in a shaded doorway and folded the goatskin over one arm. The whole strange morning began to settle in his mind like sediment drifting down through still water. The city sounded different in the late afternoon, softer. The shouting was gone. Now there was only the trickle of fountains, a warm breeze moving through the streets, and, somewhere far off, the thin, sweet notes of a lute. He passed the bakery again. The loaves were long gone, and the baker was sweeping flour from the stone floor with slow, even strokes. The oven's heat had faded to a gentle warmth. A few dark crumbs lay in the corner, like tiny forgotten stones. He passed a doorway where a woman was folding cloth into a basket, smoothing each piece before laying it down. Another woman sat nearby with a spindle, turning fiber into thread, with a motion so practiced it seemed almost thoughtless. A child slept with his head in someone's lap, one sandal loose on his foot. He passed a courtyard where a family had begun to gather for the evening. The murmur of their voices was low and unhurried. Someone poured water over dusty hands. Someone set out bread. Someone adjusted the little lamp by the household shrine, coaxing the flame upright with careful fingers. Everywhere, the city was returning to itself. The festival had passed through like a bright ribbon, but the daily pattern remained: sweep, carry, count, cook, mend, feed, lock, unlock, remember. Charlie felt no urgency now, only a drowsy, quiet contentment at having walked all the way through a single, extraordinary, ordinary day. His legs were tired in a pleasant way. The stone still held the warmth of the sun. The sky above the rooftops had gone the color of ripe plums. He walked slowly, and the city walked slowly with him, and there was nothing left that he needed to understand. He found a quiet spot near a warm doorway at the base of the hill, and lowered himself down against the wall, wrapped again in his own familiar cloak. A small oil lamp burned just inside the door, throwing a soft pool of gold across the threshold. From an upper window came the last few notes of that lute, slow and unhurried, and then silence. A fountain trickled somewhere nearby, patient as ever. The evening air smelled faintly of wood smoke, warm dust, and the day's cooling stone. Above the Palatine Hill, the first stars had begun to appear, one and then another, in a sky still holding the last violet of dusk. Charlie watched them come, his eyes growing heavier with each one. The great city breathed its last soft sounds of the day around him. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere a mother called a child inside. Somewhere keys turned at a pantry door, and a household settled into the safe little order of evening. The ancient hill, which had held shepherds and wolves and crowds and grand houses, held one tired traveler too, and did not mind at all. History, for tonight, rested along with him. Thank you for wandering through ancient Rome with me tonight. You've walked a long and gentle way, from a cool grey dawn to a doorway full of lamplight, and now there is nothing more to do and nowhere else to be. Let the rooftops fade. Let the fountains grow distant. Let Charlie stay there in the warm doorway, safe and sleepy under the stars over the Palatine, and let yourself grow just as heavy and just as calm. You don't need to remember any of it. The figs, the goatskin, the pantry keys, the white band of cloth, all of it can slip quietly away. The city will keep breathing without you, softly, in the dark. Rest well, traveler. I'll be here whenever you'd like to wander through another quiet corner of the past. For now, close your eyes and let the old city carry you the rest of the way down into sleep.